Hello, I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this video is the follow-up to my lore video on Flatwoods. Broad strokes explanation, or TLDR, of what this is: there's a lot of source material, but there's also a lot of room for interpretation. I started research on Flatwoods last fall, but I deliberately put it off because the lore fits together like a puzzle which, unless you're looking at all the pieces at once, is difficult to put together. For those of you who want to know the issues I came up against and the deliberations I came to, let's start at the beginning with the two parts that exemplify what I said just now. How old was Colonel when he was taken in by Delbert, and how was it the responders came to meet Delbert? The first definitive age we have on Colonel comes from his first survivor story when he's 13, but we don't have a date on that. We know that Dasa and Delbert met near the Morgantown airport, but there's nothing definitively saying that this was when Delbert first met the responders. Here's why I decided to go with that, and with Colonel being 12 to 13 years old when Delbert took him in. First, we know that Delbert took in a young, scared, and emotionally scarred Colonel. Second, that version of Colonel is the Colonel that we hear in his first survivor story. Third, Morgantown Airport is a logical choice as an early expansion target for the responders. And fourth, Dasa would make a good choice for the first mission to the Morgantown Airport, as she went to school in the area and should know it fairly well. These things do not by themselves preclude the responders coming by Flatwoods before Delbert met Dasa at the airport, but at least to me it makes more sense that Dasa met Delbert and then traveled back to Flatwoods with him, and then when she was there she met Colonel and recorded him. When considering this, I was tripped up on some awkward wording in her personal survivor story. On one hand, she says that she joined the responders immediately on their formation, while on the other hand, in this recording she makes well after the flood, she says that she's been with them for about 2 years. The responders formed in the closing days of 2077. The flood happened 5 years later in 2082. I think what the them and I've been with them for about 2 years now is the responders of Flatwoods. Colonel's handwriting in his notes to his father also threw me off, as they appear to be fairly bad handwriting with a fairly immature mind behind them, like something that a very young child would write. I counter this with his first survivor story, in which he recounts his bad actions in the world before the bombs. It seems to me that the things he did in school would have to take place in a middle school, not an elementary school, specifically cutting holes in all the gym shorts. Now, I fully recognize that the life of an elementary school student in the Fallout universe might be seriously different than it was for me, and that even my experience might not be the norm in the real world. But it wasn't until 6th grade, or middle school, that we changed clothes for PE. As an elementary school student, we just wore the same clothes all day long. With this in mind, while the first note entitled "Dear Daddy" seems like the work of an elementary school child, I think what we're seeing here is the writing of a terrified child that misses his father and has picked out the memory of the last time he and his father were truly happy. Something like the two of them eating cereal while camped out in sleeping bags on the living room floor, and he's trying to recreate it. With these things in mind, I believe Colonel recorded this interview at 13 in 2078, meaning he would have been born in 2064 to 2065. This would put him at about 31 or 32 years old when he died in 2096, defending the children he safeguarded. As a side note here, I really do hope those children got out, guided by maybe some of the older ones amongst them, and that someday they might return to Flatwoods. Regardless of that though, this overall situation reminded me a little bit conceptually of the fox, chicken, grain, river crossing puzzle. If you're not familiar with it, someone's trying to cross the river with a fox, a chicken, and a bag of grain, and they can only take the trip with one of these things at a time. The fox will eat the chicken if left alone with it, and the chicken will eat the grain if left alone with it. The trick to this puzzle is that the person can move an item in either direction. Previously, I had believed that the first time the responders set up an operation in the Morgantown airport was after the flood. I knew about the time the responders' police chief Mayfield fired on students in Morgantown in violation of curfew, but I didn't consider that the responders likely also set up a small outpost in Morgantown airport that they then later turned into their headquarters after the Christmas flood. In fact, it makes much more sense than assuming that they didn't have a base in the airport and then immediately try to set one up there. Why wouldn't they relocate to Flatwoods, where Delbert had been offering them the use of the church as a base for a long time, even if this move was just temporary? It makes much more sense that they chose an existing base with expansion potential like the Morgantown airport. Before this connection was made, I had the following things that didn't really fit in my head. First, the responders fleeing to the Morgantown airport in 2082 to 2083. Second, Dasa been on me meeting Delbert Winters for the first time outside the airport. Third, Dasa interviewing the 13 years old, still heavily scarred Colonel in Flatwoods and the story he told in that interview. Fourth, Dasa's recording sounding like it said she had joined the responders in 2081, despite also saying she joined up immediately. And fifth, the handwriting and contents of Colonel's Dear Daddy note. Like I said before, these things didn't quite fit. With Colonel as emotionally damaged as he was, how could she have just met him without going through Delbert? How could she have met Delbert outside the airport for the first time in 2082 or 2083 and still meet Colonel at 13 when by that time a 13-year-old would have been 7 or 8 when the bombs came down? It would have been 5 years since the bombs, and yet Colonel in the recording was still speaking as though the events were still incredibly fresh. Not only that, I have a hard time believing that, the questionable presence of gym shorts aside, that a 7 or 8-year-old could perform the pranks that Colonel claimed. It was only once I considered that Dasa could have visited the airport in 2078 for an early scouting mission long before the flood, met Delbert and followed him home to Flatwoods, that everything started to fall into place. I had to correct my understanding of the them in the I've been with them for 2 years in her Survivor story. This confusion hindered my ability to understand, let alone explain the story of Flatwoods for over a year. I hope that my explanation of my confusion has made things clearer for you. Let's talk about the other things here though. There was a point at which I thought the dates on McFadden's terminal entries in the Vaultec Agricultural Research Center might have been off. According to his log entries, he was there from April of 2093 to November of 2094. In his final log, he says that he's lost all contact with the outside world. That would make perfect sense in November of 2096, as the world was coming apart at the seams. But then I considered the fertile soil event that takes place at the site. That event can only take place because he caused the Mr. Farmans to try to process him into fertilizer, while there was still time for the responders to shut it down again and for Maria Chavez to pre-record a message should these bots turn hostile again. Along with this, the mention of the lost battle near Grafton and the scorched closing on McFadden's farm made me think we were looking at a time closer to the end, when what I think these two entries do instead is expand the scope of the war the responders were fighting on their end to keep the Scorched out of their territory. The Brotherhood was handling most of the Scorched beasts until they fell in August of 2095, but the Scorched had already broken containment and were spreading sans the beasts. There are still a few things though that I don't yet understand, and I'm going to list them here. First, why was Delbert's body left to rot after his murder, and for that matter, why was Sophia's left in the same fashion? Both of them died July 24th, 2096, and there were over 3 months before Flatwoods fell. There were other people there. The only thing that I can surmise is that they were left for the gameplay purpose of us being able to find their bodies and learn their stories. Second, why didn't Kesha McDermott, Scott Shepard, or Colonel tell Cullen McLeader about the siege of the Morgantown airport? This one really confuses me. My best and really only guess is that they didn't want to see Cullen get killed, but I'm still confused by this. I can understand why they stayed in Flatwoods while their friends fought and died. They had obligations to the refugees that had flooded into Flatwoods, but they don't even seem to have talked with Cullen. This is one that I still really don't get. Third, was the addict across the river the cause of the final raid? Maybe. I like the story being that she was, as it tied the final events better, but the truth is there's no hard evidence that she was the cause of the raider attack. This was another area that confused me for a time. Because of the disparate sign-off dates for the responders and the presence of the bodies of Delbert and Sophie Yates, despite their deaths coming months before the end, I couldn't tell with certainty when the end came for the others, namely Willie May, Colonel, Scott Shepard, and Kesha McDermott. I finally considered that the bodies of Sophie and Delbert are present, so we can find them, and as players, hear what their stories were. With that explained, the idea that the others died in a single raider attack is the conclusion that makes the most sense to me. The disparate sign-off dates aren't terribly difficult to explain. In Scott Shepard's case, I don't think that he liked the idea of Big Brother tracking him. Colonel was caretaking the children of Flatwoods. I can see him being way too busy to check into the system all the time. While I can see Kesha complying with it every now and then, I don't see her taking it as seriously as the old war veteran, Delbert. Fourth, did the coffin salesman from Ipswich actually die dropping the barbell in surprise? Possibly. The barbell is not on his neck when we find him. But why else is he still lying on the bench press? And why is his last recording on the shelf nearby? I can easily see a guest at the motel rushing over to try to save him, but it's too late. Along with these things, there's some interesting things to speculate on. For example, is Jeremiah Ward the same Jeremiah that lived in the ransacked bunker in the mire? In notes in his bunker, that Jeremiah talks about going over the Savage Divide to the west to his old moonshine shack, having loaded essentials like a shotgun. There is a moonshiner shack not far from Vault 76, and not far from Flatwoods for that matter. And Jeremiah Ward, when packing supplies to take down the raiders he thought took his granddaughter, packed a shotgun. These could easily be coincidences, but I think it is interesting to consider nonetheless. Another bit of speculation we can discuss is whether the Tabitha that passes through Flatwoods in Fallout 76 is the Tabitha that we can meet at Black Mountain in Fallout New Vegas. It seems far-fetched, but let me lay out to you why this could be a possibility. First, the Tabitha from Fallout 76 told Dasa Ben Ami that she was going to head out west. Second, in 2102, Richard Gray fell into a vat of FEV at the Mariposa military base and began to transform into the Master. And third, Tabitha in Fallout New Vegas was formerly a part of the Master's Unity. It's a long way from Appalachia to California, making it a remote possibility, but it does in fact seem possible that within the timeline of events, that Tabitha could have trekked across the post-apocalyptic landscape and fallen prey to the Master. One final interesting thing to consider is the English salesman at the Green Country Lodge. He's in the United States doing business locally with plans to return to Ipswich. This is interesting to me because I had always thought that Europe had been devastated by the resource wars that were fought between the European Commonwealth and the Middle East over the supply of oil. The fact that there's air travel between the UK and the US could mean many things, but two interesting possibilities are that the UK might have not been part of the European Commonwealth, and as such wasn't devastated by the war, or that Europe had begun to recover by October 2077. Either possibility is an interesting bit of potential lore. Okay, I think that's enough explanation and speculation. If you do have any other questions about how I arrived at the conclusions I did, please feel free to ask them in the comments or on Twitter, where you can find me at Gaming with Maps. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.